why don't we start with, well, let me introduce our panelists, of course. So we have Cristina Najera and Othello Richards, who are from the College of Media and Communication. They are going to be presenting a study called An Analysis of Attitudes and Perceptions of Body Image Among Young Adult Hispanic Women. We have Andrew Gibb, who is from Visual and Performing Arts here at Texas Tech as well. And he's going to be presenting a little taste of Scotland, race, gender, and football in the borderlands. And the last study is from Gabriel Dominguez Partida and myself, from the College of Media and Communication, and our study is called A Place South of the Border, the Contemporary Framing of Mexico and Mexicans in Hollywood Cinema. So why don't we start with you, Cristina? Please go ahead with Cristina and Othello, yeah.
Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so here we go. So both me and Othello are graduate candidates here in the College of Media and Communication. And as Dr. Rendon mentioned, we will be talking about a study that we've been working on for about a year now in terms of attitudes and perceptions of body image and beauty among a young adult Hispanic women population. But before we begin, we want to go ahead and thank the Regent Profession Small Grant Program because they did grant us funding, so that way we can actually complete this study. So to start off, this actually all began back in the fall of 2018 with a survey. And at that time, we wanted to look to see what were those attitudes and perceptions, if there were any differences between a Hispanic and a non-Hispanic young adult women population. So what we did find was that higher media consumption do lead to more comparisons in terms of physicality and beauty, and that a thinner body type is the ideal body. And this is not something new. This is not something that we just finally discovered. This is very much so backed up by media. I'm sorry, by literature, when you put together media and then body image research. But the one thing that we did notice was that in the Hispanic women population, they perceived their body type to be much larger than it actually was compared to the non-Hispanic women group. So kind of how we got to this finding was that we would ask them to rate using this photographic figure rating scale, which body here that you see was, or what they thought the ideal body was, and then what they perceive their own body type to be. And with the Hispanic women population, the group, they would tended to range or choose the larger numbers or the larger bodies than what they actually did. And kind of how we did that is because we actually calculated their body mass number, because we did ask for their height and their approximate weight, so that way we can go ahead and get that. And when we ran those analyses, we did see that compared to those actual numbers, they were perceiving their body types to be much larger.
But, you know, there's only so much that a survey can tell you. Surveys has limitations, and so that's why we focused on interviews, in-depth interviews with these young women here. What an interview can tell us is the why. We can dive deeper into the subject. And so, as Cristina was saying, this focus of the study was on the perceptions and attitudes that these women had about their own body type. And so we're really getting into them. And so we're in this interview together, and we're asking them to talk about their bodies. I mean, who wants to talk about their bodies? One thing, I'll go to the end. One of the last questions we asked them was, because Cristina and I both did the interviews together, and we asked them, did me being in the room influence their answers? Out of everybody, only one person says she was a little shy when it came to one part of the interview, but for the most part, me being a man in the room and sitting and having these women talk about their own bodies didn't really influence what they told us.
So a lot of the body image research out there really uses social comparison theory as a ground to look at this, I guess, phenomena. And there's 3 components to social comparison theory, and we actually focused on the first one, the self-evaluation. Because to get to those attitudes and perceptions, we wanted to see kind of what was guiding these comparisons, so these self-evaluations. So in social comparison theory, in self-evaluation is very much so one comparing themselves in the context compared to other people. And it could be like women to women, or sometimes even men, depending on skill. And the big one is physicality in terms of what is lacking. When it comes to self-improvement, what this theory posits is very much so, there is a skill or a task that I could do better, not in terms of like I lack efficiency or I lack something, but I'm gonna go ahead and work on this to become better. And then the last thing is the self-enhancement, which focuses on threats on self-esteem and self-worth and value. And at that point, they become a little bit of a, I'm comparing myself to other people, but in terms of kind of minimizing them to make me feel better, so that way I can protect my self-worth and value. So for this, we wanted to very much so look at these self-evaluations, because these evaluations not necessarily lead to this self-improvement, but you see them with the self-enhancement a little.
And so we have 3 main research questions in this project. One was, what are young adult Hispanic women's perceptions towards body image ideals? When they see these ideals, what do they see there? And also, what are their attitudes towards these body image ideals? How does it make them feel? How do they react? What action does this solicit when they base on the perception of the ideal body there? And then what leads young adult Hispanic women to self-evaluate and compare their body type to the body image ideals? And so throughout this research, you'll see that there are a bunch of reoccurring themes as we went about it. And so what we did, our methodology, we conducted interviews 2 separate times. One was, this began as a class project, or actually it was a paper for a class. And during that time, we collected 6 interviews. We needed more time. And so this past fall, Cristina and I conducted 8 more interviews. And we reached the total of 14 when we hit the saturation point. We felt that we weren't getting many new answers. Everything, I mean, we started seeing a theme, a recurring theme. And so when we hit that saturation point, which is about 14 interviews, we stopped interviewing participants there. And these were young Hispanic women students at Texas Tech University. So I was saying our theme, so first of all, we wanted to get their definition of beauty there. And one thing that emerged was this dichotomy between one's personality and physicality there. People always seem to mention personality first before the physical features of beauty. We don't know if this was more social desirability effect there, where they didn't want to go straight to bodily features, but they first of all mentioned the personality. And so we're going to read a bunch of quotes from some of our participants. One being Daniela. She says, I guess being physically attractive, but that all depends on the person. So physically attractive, but then that's also kind of ties into a person's personality. So like I can completely think someone is attractive and then I meet them and they suck there. So that was Daniela. Then we have Jane over here. Jane, she believed that society puts a greater emphasis on physical beauty rather than inner beauty. She says, I feel like society's like, okay, you can have a pretty personality, but if your face isn't pretty, then it's like, you know what? You know what I mean? There. And so, I mean, what she's saying that the physical features trump a person's inner beauty within there.
Another thing that we did see that kind of sprung up that we wanted to know was, how are these definitions of beauty coming about? And one that was a very strong recurring theme was media, specifically with Instagram, Snapchat, and YouTube, social media. And this is a couple of our participants' quotes that basically encompass kind of what everybody else was already saying. And we have, for example, Amy, where she states, well, like I get on Instagram a lot, and so Instagram models, and so they all kind of look the same. And so you're like, I guess, the more you see it, you're like, yeah, that is pretty, I guess, you know? And another, along with social media, you will see this come up a lot, that there's a specific look that goes with those thinner body ideals that go with what they believe beauty is. Another one that actually was, I would say, kind of surprising is mothers. A lot of them did discuss that a lot of these definitions of what beauty should be are coming directly from their mothers. We have, for example, Daniela say or share, okay, well, the girl wants like small, petite, stuff like that. Mom was always like pressuring me, like when I was little, I had in my mind that I needed to look like my cousin. There was actually, this actually came up several times where our participants stated their mothers would compare them to either their siblings or other family members in terms of them being thinner or what they should look like. And then she ends her quote with, my cousin is like 5'3" and 90 pounds. That's kind of always like stuck in my head. And then we have another one here by Jane, where she says, I don't think I have like the best body, honestly, but I think a lot of it, honestly, I think comes from my mom too, because even though she didn't say anything when I was younger, like now, she kind of like recently, honestly, she's been like, you're gaining weight, like you're gaining weight. And apart from just what they're saying, like how they were saying it, you can really tell that these words have stuck, even though, let's say, for Daniela, that was told when she was younger, compared to here with Jane, that she's been hearing it more often, you could see that this is very much affecting their own definition of beauty. Oh, yes, this is me. I was like, wait, is that me or is that Othello? So another theme that actually came up was that they are comparing themselves to other women. And the strongest comparisons when they actually occur is when they are being exposed to this media, especially in social media, where we see a couple of our participants say that these comparisons come about, or they begin when they're actually, streaming on social media, or they're seeing something on TV or a magazine. And this is where they actually become very specific in terms of what they think and what they feel about what that specific body type should be. And here Jane has something that came up several times throughout our study. And she says, I think it has a lot to do with like the influencers that I do follow, so it's them. I see them and they're like, have this skinny body and like a big booty or some like big boobies or like, you know what I mean? It's just like, I guess I see that on my timeline or on my Snapchat, when they post on Snapchat. So I guess I see it all the time. So I'm like, oh, that's how I should be.
Okay, and so talk about the perceptions. I mean, one thing these ladies, women told us was that all women compare themselves to others. So I always caution my journalism students with using the word all and every, and I'm always like, is it really everybody? Is it really? But they were saying all women compare themselves to others. Amy saying, I think like a lot of times that's why people post things so that people can see them. Oh, I look so good. Like you wish you looked like me there. And so here's this comparison thing. This other one here from Jennifer, talking about all women comparing themselves. She says, I don't know what they're drinking here, but they're gorgeous. So here's Jennifer comparing herself, of course, to other people here on campus. As she laughs, she says, I don't even know why these girls are so pretty. Like if you go to a tailgate and stuff like that, these girls are wearing like their best outfits. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is my mom's old denim skirt. So here goes that comparison right there, social comparison, comparing their bodies, what other women are wearing, what other women look like to others there. Another one was, what we saw was that they kept on emphasizing negative aspects about their bodies and about the shape of the bodies. Rarely did we ever get something positive. When we asked them to describe the body type or whatever, it was always in the negative sense there. It's Jane saying, I really don't have no curves. Like my legs, I don't know if you noticed when I walked in, but they're super skinny. Amy, I'm soft, an upside down triangle. My legs are pretty skinny. Sam, I would just say really small, petite. I have really skinny arms, like super skinny legs there. So once again, it was never much in a positive light. It was always focusing on what they lacked as opposed to what are some of the great features, some of the most positive features about their body.
Then, as I mentioned earlier, the thinner body type was the more ideal. You saw the scale at the beginning, the rating scale. So this is what they're referring to in terms of the numbers. When they say 2 or 3, you can see those are like the much skinnier body types in that scale. But a lot of them, there was hardly anybody who went maybe above maybe a 4 or a 5-ish. But in terms of what they would consider the ideal body type, were a much like smaller, petite. But then we see these other themes come up in terms of enhancing certain body parts. For example, Daniela says probably going to be a 2 or 3. And like right now, at least a 2 or 3, and there's going to be big boobs and a big butt and a tiny little waist, and the stomach is going to be flat. Apart from that, they did add in terms of, they did give us examples of who would actually encompass like the ideal body type. And the number one socialite that came up, in case if you're already thinking Kim Kardashian, yes, Kim Kardashian was actually one of the ones, apart from other social influencers that look that or have that type of Kim Kardashian look, you know, the long dark hair, and as Daniela stated, certain body parts are very enhanced, you know, flat tummies, and tiny little waists are basically what, you know, most of our participants were saying is the ideal body type.
Yeah, Kim Kardashian seems to be a huge influencer there. They all brought it up. We didn't have to bring it up. Yeah.
And some of them were like, you know, I would even say that Kim Kardashian would be, or there was a couple of participants say, I'm actually looking, when they were looking at the rating scale, to see which one looked more like Kim Kardashian. Another theme that actually came up is these use of descriptors, because we were really curious to see if there were any like type of specific descriptors that they must have grown up with or that are currently used or known as. I'm Hispanic and I grew up listening to these around, not necessarily towards me or to other people, but I knew what they meant, right? And obviously with me, it was like, do not use these. But we were kind of curious to see if this was a thing. And it turns out that, unfortunately, it is. You see gorda, gordis, and then flaca come up pretty often. Almost every single participant either gave us one or all of these. Gorda and gordis basically means like chubby or fat, and flaca basically means skinny. And sometimes these were used as, hey, to describe negatively their own bodies, or they're used to describe family members' bodies, or just like other people's bodies in general. And obviously it was always in a negative light.
And so we're almost done with this paper. As I was saying, we've analyzed 6 of the interviews. We still need about 8 more interviews that we're analyzing as well. Looking for themes, for any new themes. Was that, as I was saying, we hit this saturation point where we weren't getting anything new there. We also were anticipating running a sentiment analysis using some computer software. One is Luke, the linguistic inquiry and word count, and we call it MAD, the meaning extraction helper. These will, they could help to calculate the degree to which various categories of words are used in text, and also they can also give a sentiment, overall sentiment of some of these things that were appearing. Because as you know, when you transcribe 14, 30 to hour-long interviews, you have a lot of text. And so we believe that these softwares can help to supplement some of the qualitative data that we already have here.
And these are just some images that we wanted to share. Obviously, the woman and the blonde woman is just like the ideal kind of skinny, kind of what they were like, oh, this is what the ideal body type would be. But then the women to the middle and then to the right, as you can see, the right one is Kim Kardashian. But if you see the other 2 in the middle, these are actually social influencers that have a lot of followers. But if you see, that look is very much so the trend. It's the long dark hair and certain body types enhanced, as our example Daniela shared. This is kind of what is in right now, and this is kind of what we should look like, question mark.
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you, Othello. We have a question from Dr. Kent Wilkinson, and he's asking you about the emphasis on social media. He's saying the emphasis on social media is somewhat expected based on the literature. Was there any reference to legacy media? Like for instance, you all remember the J-Lo and Shakira performance at the Super Bowl. So did you find anything like that?
Not necessarily in terms of the performance, but there was a couple of participants who did say, oh, not Shakira, but J-Lo, in terms of when they were describing the body type. You know, J-Lo has, obviously, the bottom half of her is more enhanced, but that was like her way of expressing that's what that body part should be, kind of what is in. That's kind of what the ideal body type should look like, but not in terms of empowerment or in terms of being sexy or any of those anything else that might come up. It was more in terms of this is what we're thinking because we see it often, and this is what the ideal should be.
Yeah, and also, I mean, our interviews that preceded the Super Bowl. So the last round was in the fall before the Shakira, and but J-Lo did come up, but obviously Shakira didn't come up. But it would be interesting to have seen regarding legacy media what we would have said had we done these interviews after the Super Bowl. There,
that would have been really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody have any other questions for Cristina and Othello? You can do it now or maybe at the end of the conversation. So Paul is asking if did people not comment on personality resulting in beauty? So this is an interesting question because probably some people, they were talking about how probably the image that they wanted to reflect and probably not so much on beauty, or what do you think, Cristina, Othello?
Yeah, Othello, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so personality, so we're saying those were the two themes that came up, personality first. Usually they mention personality first, reflecting inner beauty, but if somebody's personality was really bad and they were beautiful, if they were physically beautiful and the personality was really bad, then they looked at them as being not beautiful, not a beautiful person. But I just lost my thought there. I was talking about personality. My mind just blanked on something I wanted to say. But yeah, once again, I mean, those two did go hand in hand, but personality always seemed to come first, and then they talked about the physical beauty there.
So they go hand in hand, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Another question from Nadia Flores. She's saying, I was wondering, compared to the previous findings in this same topic, what are your novel findings that you got from this study compared to the previous findings?
There were some overlap, but I think the ones that I haven't really seen, at least in the articles that we've reviewed for this, for example, like those influences from like mothers, and not just mothers as growing up, but still currently now. And we did ask them like where they had grown up, right? To give us a little bit more context. And all of these women are like second or third, like Hispanic generations. And it's you know, like their household is very much so not very patriotic, patriotic, but it's that was one of the most surprising ones, I'm going to say, but also the very specific trend in terms of the influence that social media is having. We already know social media has, you know, it comes with their ups and downs, but that very specific painting that it's posing in terms of what beauty should be, because even they themselves question it, that the more that they see it, that's what it should be, even though they know. A couple of our participants did mention, well, we know these are, you know, Photoshop, maybe they use filters, but they still look this certain way, and everybody's looking this certain way, so maybe I should be looking a certain way. But
I'm sorry, there is literature out there saying that, of course, beauty pageants, for instance, are much more popular among Latino populations. Mm-hmm. So all these cultural attributes many times also affect the way people perceive themselves, right? Mm-hmm. You wanted to add something else, Cristina, before we move on to the next presentation?
Othello, do you want to add something else?
Nothing in particular. As I was saying, as Cristina was saying, moms. Yeah, I think if we were to retitle our paper when we're done, it has to have the word mom in the title someplace, because moms play a big role in body image ideals and how these women perceive themselves and the perception of what beauty is. how much they talk about how much influence their mom had on them growing up there. And then I remember my last thought, talking about physicality and personality. A lot of times it seems like when they're growing up, as they're younger, it was more physical. Beauty was more physical, but as it got older and more mature, it became more about the personality. And so that's one thing that we noticed that several people mentioned there.
Good. So thank you, Cristina and Othello, for that. Let's move on to Andrew Gibbs' presentation. He's from the Department of Visual and Performing Arts, and he's going to be talking about a study entitled A Little Taste of Scotland, Race, Gender, and Football in the Borderlands. So Andrew, whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Rendon. The research I'd like to share with you today is still in its infancy, and so I hope that that you'll forgive me if I don't reach many fully formed conclusions. My project is one of local history. It's an analysis of a performance that is part of the extracurricular student life of Bel Air High School in El Paso, Texas. Bel Air is located in what might nowadays be considered central El Paso. The city stretches out considerably to the west and to the east of its traditional city center. But when it was built in 1957, Bel Air stood at the eastern edge of the city, where new suburban housing developments were encroaching upon the dairy farms of the area. The name Bel Air was meant to evoke Scottish cultural traditions, and to elaborate on that theme, the moniker of Highlander was chosen. Within a few short years of the school's opening, a further extension of that conceit, the Bel Air Pipe Band was formed, named for their playing of that most evocative of Scottish musical instruments, the bagpipe. The performances of this group are the subject of my talk today. In the title of my presentation, I evoke race as a key framework for analyzing the performances of the pipe band. And I think that such a framework is particularly appropriate when one considers the ethnic contours of Bel Air High School's past. Local oral history suggests that the choice of the name Bel Air and the cultivating of Scottish traditions may have been a conscious move by local whites, both those who dominated the nearby dairy industry and those moving into the new housing development surrounding the school, to carve out an Anglo-dominated cultural sphere within a school district centered on the neighborhood of Isleta, whose population was largely Mexican-American. Whether or not this account is entirely accurate, a subsequent shift in local demographics soon meant that Bel Air, its Highlanders, and its pipe band were comprised of a student body that was predominantly Mexican-American. This means that on Friday nights in the fall, in a football stadium less than 4 miles from the Rio Grande and thus the US-Mexico border, a group of largely made up of Mexican-American students regularly don the costume of Highland Scots and play bagpipes. While the performance of Scottish artistic traditions might be interpreted as oddly out of place anywhere outside of Scotland, and may indeed seem strange when interpreted by anyone besides the Scots themselves, I think it's worth considering what such a cross-ethnic cultural borrowing might tell us about the formation of community identity in the Borderlands region centered on El Paso, Texas. That said, this brief introduction is as far as I intend to go today in considering the racial implications of the Bel Air Pipe Band's performance. For the remainder of this presentation, I'll instead focus on a gender analysis of that performance. Nevertheless, I've included race in my title and raised these issues here because I think it's important at the outset to establish a filter of race through which my gender analysis can and should be viewed. What makes the pipe band so readily suited to a gender analysis is the fact that since its formation in 1960 until the early 1990s, a period representing more than half of its 60-plus years of operation, membership in the band was restricted to female students. This despite the fact that piping in Scotland was historically, and in large part continues to be, a predominantly male activity. In analyzing the components of the pipe band performance that I've so far been able to establish, I've arrived at a hypothesis regarding the social function that it may perform for the young women who participate in it. I believe that Bel Air's pipe band offers them an opportunity to renegotiate traditional gendered spheres of behavior in ways that allow them to more fully participate in the project of community identity formation. I unconsciously employ the word negotiate here, as I do not believe the pipe band represents an entirely unproblematic opportunity for female empowerment or increased gender parity. In order to illustrate from whence my hypothesis arises, I'd like to share with you brief analyses of 3 particular activities that contribute to the overall pipe band performance: the Hall March, the Highland Dances, and the Civic Appearances the band makes outside the confines of the Bel Air campus. The first 2 roughly illustrate the negotiation of gendered spheres that I believe the pipe band's performance represents. And the third speaks to how that negotiation plays out in the larger arena of community identity formation in the city of El Paso. Before proceeding to those analyses, however, I would like to say a word about costuming, as that component element of the pipe band performance is a key factor in all of the examples I'll share today. The pipe band uniform has changed over the years, but for the first few decades of the group's history, the design very closely imitated full-dress Highland regalia, including most prominently the kilt and the military cut jacket of historical Scottish war attire. Knee socks, spats, and garrison caps rounded out the uniform for most members. I would argue that in putting on these traditional Highland military togs, the young women of the pipe band appropriated the masculine power associated with them, or at the very least, put the masculinity attributed to such garb into play. 2 particular accessories that may have been grafted onto the traditional uniform in an attempt to limit any potential threat to this Highland drag may have presented to traditional gender roles. During the initial decades of the pipe band's existence, the drum major, who's the woman seen here in the middle of this image, wore a white bearskin cap, as opposed to the black bearskin cap that her male Scottish counterparts typically wear. One could easily imagine that such a headpiece was purchased through a catalog aimed at a market of baton twirlers. The pipe band's white gloves might also be interpreted as a feminizing touch, as many male Scottish pipers do not wear them, though those who do most commonly are drum majors, so perhaps the designers of Bel Air's pipe band uniforms were simply going for the most distinguished look, one that could add respectability and thus power to their performance. The centerpieces of the pipe band's performance are the pre-shows that precede Friday night home football games, the halftime shows of the same, and the sideline displays during the game itself. In all these moments, the pipe band engages in displays of the traditional masculine Scottish activities of piping and kilt wearing, but such activity is not limited to the football stadium on Friday nights. Another standard performance of the pipe band, the so-called Hall March, actually occurs in the absence of the football team. To my mind, this allows for a more simple and direct analysis of the pipe band's renegotiation of gender roles within the Bel Air community. On the Fridays of home football games, the pipe band marches through the hallways of Bel Air, playing their traditional Scottish repertoire. My analysis of these performances is based in part on the pipe band's appropriation of traditionally masculine attire and instrumentation, but also borrows from my own admittedly subjective experience as a member of a high school marching band that occasionally engaged in similar hall marches. Within the performance space of the Friday night football game, the performance of all student spirit groups are subordinated to that of the football team. With an event such as the Hall March, however, that relationship is upended, and the auxiliary group becomes the center of the show and the standard bearer of the school's pride. In the case of the pipe band, this power shift is not only from one student group to another, but from the preeminently male student organization, the football team, to a female-dominated one. This transition may already have been normalized to some extent by the pipe band's appropriation of traditional male attire, but I also believe that the pipe band's ascendance in this moment is supported by the sonic contours of their performance. When I personally used to participate in hall marches, I played my trombone as loudly as ever I did on the football field or in the stands. My recollection is that I was consciously attempting to impose some level of sonic discomfort on all within hearing range. In this way, I imagined myself and my band to be not only the center of attention, but the source of an aggressive and thus, by cultural association, masculine school spirit. Until such times I'm able to question pipe band members on the topic, I cannot say for certain if such an expression of aggressive spirit is their intent with the Hall March performance. But whatever pipe band members might say about their intent, Their performance's reception by their fellow students and teachers must certainly be affected by the sonic cacophony generated by a mass of skirling bagpipes confined within the enclosed space of a high school's locker-lined hallways. It must be incredibly loud. What must the effect be of witnessing the women of Bel Air generate, in the absence of men, this traditionally masculine soundscape and spectacle? If we can accept that the Hall March does indeed represent a significant advance by the pipe band's women into the male sphere of the noisily patriotic, then their performance of Highland Dancing perhaps best exemplifies the negotiated price that must be paid for the chance to temporarily transgress the borders of traditional gendered spheres of activity. Like the Hall March, halftime shows and sideline pep performances present the women of the pipe band a chance to demonstrate their mastery of a traditional masculine instrument while wearing the customary garb of the male masters of such instruments. Within a few years of the pipe band's incorporation, however, a telling addition was made to their standard repertoire, that of Highland Dancing. Historically, Highland Dancing in Scotland was gendered as a male activity quite as much as pipe playing was. In this sense, its adoption by the pipe band would seem a natural move to incorporate such dancing into the performances of piping and drumming, and one might expect its appropriation to be just as gender transgressive. But I would argue that such an interpretation does not hold within the performance norms of US high school football. Within that realm, any and all dancing, whether by cheerleaders or dance teams, has long since been coded as female. In recent decades, of course, the rise of competitive cheer and dance has secured a level of respect for these activities commensurate with that given to the marquee male-dominated sports. Nevertheless, I would argue that the performances of young women dancers and cheerleaders at high school football games continue to function, at least partially, as displays of the female body offered up to the male gaze. Within such a persistent dynamic of gendered power relations, it would be exceedingly difficult for the young women of the pipe band to perform Highland dance in a manner that would avoid their objectification. The evidence I've collected thus far would seem to support the interpretation that the pipe band's leadership and members have made little attempt to combat such objectification. On the contrary, it would seem that they have made a Faustian bargain to display their bodies through Highland dance in exchange for the extraordinary opportunity to challenge gender prescriptions elsewhere. Once again, this complex negotiation is perhaps most visible in costume choices. In this image showing now, a pipe band member is pictured practicing the sword dance. Despite the martial nature of this dance, before saying it, the young woman has removed her military cut jacket to reveal a billowy white shirt and frilly cuffs and a form-fitting vest. In this dance version of the uniform, the white gloves noted earlier seem to take on an even more pronounced feminized feel. In the Highland dancing portion of their performance, the pipe band literally shed their masculinizing outer garments, revealing a female form that is offered up to the crowd's pleasure. Of course, just as is the case with cheerleading and dance team performances, Highland dancing offers the young women of the pipe band an opportunity to display their somatic prowess. The key difference is that dance team members and cheerleaders do not have the opportunity to re-don their military gear and take up their noisemakers once their dance routine is complete. I've chosen to highlight the contrasting performances of the Hall March and the Highland Dance to illustrate the fine line that the female members of the pipe band have to walk in order to secure an uncommon opportunity to contribute to the identity formation of the community that is the Bel Air High School student body. But I have suggested that the pipe band affords its young women a more prominent voice in the community identity formation of the El Paso community as a whole. The evidence supporting this assertion derives from the fact that since shortly after its formation, the pipe band has regularly been invited to perform at various civic events throughout the city. Here we have examples of a 1977 parade mounted by El Paso to honor the visit of former President Ford to that city, and the pipe band performance in a nursing home in that same year. It is through a regular calendar of such appearances over the past 6 decades that the Bel Air Pipe Band has performed their gender renegotiation on a citywide scale. The extent to which the pipe band's negotiation of traditional gender spheres has been able to successfully participate in the community identity formation of a wider El Paso can be seen in the final example I'd like to share with you today. On August 5th, 2019, 2 days after a mass shooting at an El Paso Walmart, an improvised memorial service was held to honor the victims. Hearing of the gathering, 25-year-old Julie Gomez, an alumna of Bel Air, grabbed her pipes and headed to the site. In the years since graduating, Ms. Gomez has regularly played at memorial services honoring local first responders, law enforcement, and soldiers at nearby Fort Bliss. At such events, Gomez appears in full Highland regalia. On the day of the Walmart Memorial, however, she brought only herself and her pipes. There she played Amazing Grace for the assembled crowd in honor of the victims. Local news coverage briefly noted Gomez's training at Bel Air, but her appearance out of uniform served to separate her from a close association with her high school. Furthermore, the news commentators made no reference to Gomez's gender when discussing her piping career. As framed by local media figures, Gomez represented simply young El Paso, responding to a civic crisis in a fashion that was characteristically El Pasoan. In this moment, I would argue, 6 decades of performance by the young women of Bel Air High School came to its full civic fruition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gibb. I have a question from Paul to you. He's saying, well, a comment first and then a question. He says, thanks for pointing out a surprising tradition present in an El Paso high school, which is something that I share. I had no idea that they had this tradition in a school in El Paso. And Paul's question is, have activities been added to school traditions to align more with the cultural history of the student population?
Within the sort of the frame of the football performance, the overall football performance, it's my understanding that there was, in addition to the marching band and the pipe band, that there was at some point in the school's history a sort of Latinx music sort of performing troupe, which I think performed in the stands during performances. But I don't think Bel Air High School has, for instance, a folklorico group or a mariachi group, things that might sort of signal Mexican American. And one of the interesting things about the pipe band performance is that since its beginning, there has been this sort of, it would seem to me, a conscious attempt to maintain the sort of purity of that particular European tradition. There's been no attempts that I would say to sort of syncretize the whole thing. Not only in the continued traditional Scottish uniforms and so on, but if you're looking at the yearly yearbooks, they will often have a title like, Pipers Maintain Scottish Tradition. The sort of interesting thing there is that not only does there seem to be some sort of competition or need to balance out that Scottish performance, but rather the sort of embracing of the purity of it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to see how these fusions of culture, because I'm guessing that it might be happening in some other parts of Texas or in other areas of the United States. So if you don't mind, let's move on to our third presentation, and then we will have a little bit of time for a few more questions to close the symposium. So if you don't mind, Gabriel, sharing the presentation. So this is I'm a co-author of this study, and I'm going to start talking a little bit about this. Gabriel Dominguez Partida, he's the first author of this study. It's actually his study, and I'm just helping him a little bit. And our research for this project is called Cinema and the Ethnic Divide, Contemporary Representations of Mexico and Mexicans in Hollywood Films. So we were very interested in seeing, there are several papers out there in the literature that are saying that, of course, the images of Mexico and Mexicans in Hollywood films has improved. The representation of Mexico and Mexicans has improved over the years. There are more and more scholars stating this. And we were interested in looking at this idea and trying to see if it's actually true. Because of course, as you all might know, the images that we see in films and how different countries and different ethnic groups are represented affects the way people, the general population perceives those other groups or those other countries, at the extent that the general population might feel, for instance, that all the Arabs in the world are in one specific way, or that all Mexicans behave and have a culture that is very specific, right? Or in some more extreme cases, people might create just these huge general groups in which, for instance, Latin America, in which they are allowed to say, or they say, all Latin Americans are like this, right? So this reinforcement of stereotypes in many ways originates, and for a lot of people who haven't had the opportunity to travel to other parts of the world or to meet people from different cultural backgrounds, it allows them to reinforce these stereotypes. And the literature also states that there is a kind of media representation that was established before the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was more negative. And then after NAFTA, with the so-called inclusion of Mexico in economic terms in North America, of course, geographically, it has always been part of North America, but with the creation of NAFTA, a lot of people perceived that that was the point when Mexico was included to North America in an economic sense, and therefore Mexico joined the first world, whatever that means, right? So all these depictions of different ethnic groups and different countries, they have an actual impact in how we perceive what we consider to be out groups, right? But not only that, we also create and reinforce ideas related to what we perceive that is our own group. And of course, we wanted to look at this from a longitudinal perspective. And we did a study of many films that were showed in theaters from the year 2000 to 2019. So we wanted to see if it's actually true that the images of Mexicans and Mexico has improved over the years. Of course, there is this whiteness element that we need to consider whenever we talk about Hollywood, right? The way Hollywood has operated for many, many years up to this day emphasizes the idea of whiteness and how people should aspire to be like the ethnic group that is supposed to be the dominant group, right? If you look at 90% of the films, or even more, they all have these ethnic dynamics in which the whiteness element is always something that people need to look up to, something that they need to aspire in their lives. And of course, this has created a homogenization of cultural characteristics, because a lot of people who are from different cultural backgrounds, they tend to adopt the things that they think that will be admired by other people. And because films, such a powerful media industry that has, of course, been used as a military tool in some cases, of course, this has the power of creating these images and reinforcing the idea that a specific ethnic group is better than the rest of the ethnic groups out there. Can we go to the next slide, Gabriel, first? So, of course, there are many ways to interpret reality, right? So if for any of you who have been in Mexico, In Mexico, it's not one country, right? We have Mexico, is like being several countries in one. And of course, we have the context of the big urban areas like in Mexico City, Guadalajara, or Monterrey, which of course have very developed areas with HSI, I mean, with the quality of life very similar to the most advanced economies in the world. But at the same time, you have this staggering inequality that creates these little towns or these rural areas especially in very poor states where people really struggle to survive every single day, which was one of the issues with this coronavirus crisis, because they were saying, well, yeah, we are going to tell people that are trying to survive every single day to stay at home. And of course, it's necessary for us to be able to stop the crisis, but at the same time, there is a specific population in some countries, even here in the US, that they actually cannot afford to stop getting money because they would stop eating, right? So this image, these Hollywood representations of Mexico have been very negative since the 1920s, since the time of the silent cinema. And of course, those influence the way the rest of the world also perceives Mexico and Mexicans, because as we all know, Hollywood is the largest media industry in terms of films, right? So one way to solve this is that some researchers have stated that we can include different characters, that diversity is actually one of the ways for us to overcome these stereotypes and these very biased representations of different countries, different nationalities, different ethnic groups, right? Which is, again, the case of the Arab culture, for instance. Nowadays, I think all of the representations that we get in relation to that culture is related to terrorism and these ideas of how they are a threat to the US and to the Western cultures, right? So, yeah, can we go to the next one, please, Gabriel? So of course, these stereotypes on in-groups and out-groups, as I mentioned before, generate these stereotypical responses, and that directly affects the ability of people, and I mean regular people. Of course, we are all privileged to be related to academia, but for most people, the images that they receive from films, it becomes a way for them to relate to other ethnic groups and to other cultures. And of course, this reinforces the stereotypes at the degree that several researchers have found that the media representations over the years about the Latinx communities in the US and or Mexicans, they are constantly being depicted as inferiors, right? And as I mentioned, inclusion is one of the ways for us to look at solving these misleading representations or portrayals of different ethnic groups. So we had four main research questions. The first one was related to the representations associated with Mexico and Mexicans in the films produced from the year 2000 to the year 2019. And the second one was about the representation of Mexico and Mexicans in contemporary films, in contemporary Hollywood films, but specifically how this representation has evolved over the years. Are we actually receiving more positive images lately in relation to Mexico and Mexicans? So that was the second one. And then the third one was about Mexico as in films where Mexico was the primary location of contemporary Hollywood films. Was that a factor for getting more positive portrayals of Mexico and Mexicans? So what that means is if we see a film, a Hollywood production that is displaying Mexican settings or that is being filmed in Mexican territory, would that produce a more positive representation of Mexicans in Mexico? And the last research question was about the inclusion of Mexican characters. So the research states that if we are inclusive, and that if we include characters from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, then we can actually improve the representations, or to at least try to get a little bit a more accurate representation of different ethnic groups. And that is what the research question 4 is trying to address here. So we took 67 films from the year 2000 to 2019. All of them were produced by Hollywood companies. And of course, we wanted to look at those representations that were popular, that had some impact in the box office. So we looked at Rotten Tomatoes and the IMDb database, and looked at the films that had more than 1,000 votes. We created, to make this project manageable, we created a stratified sample of 39 scripts. We got the 39 scripts of all those films, and we used a machine-assisted textual analysis tool to look at the way Mexicans and Mexico were being represented in those films. And also we looked at the context in which these words were being mentioned, right? Were there any positive or negative descriptors related to them, and things similar to that.
And what do we find?
Oh yeah, please go ahead, Gabriel.
What do we find? Well, let's go back to the research questions and discuss a little bit about what was asking on those research questions. The first one was talking about the main representations associated with Mexico and Mexicans in Hollywood films produced from 2000 to 2018. What we try to do in this is the content analysis to understand in which moments the word Mexico and Mexicans were used in the scripts of the films that we analyzed. And by doing this textual analysis, helping by this software, well, we found that, as if you can see, in Mexico, as a positive mention, dominates the sense that Mexico is a geographical place outside of the US, and Mexico City is the biggest city in the country. What you maybe could say, well, there are not really positive mentions, are more neutral, but we took those neutral mentions as positive, as if you notice, when we are talking about the negative aspects of Mexico, we will find that those terms are using in a very harmful way, saying that Mexico is a dangerous place, Mexico is violent and corrupt, is uncivilized and inferior. And comparing those terms with what those films talk about Mexicans, we will find several similarities in the negative aspect. Mexicans are portrayed as inferior or primitive, dangerous, corrupt, a disease, or illegal and or undocumented. But in the positive side, it is noticeable to perceive that they are portraying Mexicans as brave, hardworking, exotic, in a sense that the culture is very, very interesting, at least from the point of view of the white or US characters that are in the film, talented, are equal to US citizens. So with those terms, we start analyzing if there is an evolution of the positive or negative image in Mexico from 2000 to 2019. Then, in the second research question, has the representation of Mexicans Mexico and Mexicans in contemporary Hollywood films evolved to portray them more positively? We don't find any significant difference between the prevalence of these negative and positive depictions of Mexican or Mexicans. It doesn't mean that this result is not important. Indeed, as Dr. Rendon was saying, many of the studies that are published right now are saying that since NAFTA, we are having a more positive image of Mexico, but we are analyzing these specific scripts. We notice that there is no truth. There is not an evolution that is distinctive between the positive and the negative image of Mexico. We can say that there is a prevalence of both images along the way. So there is no, or at least we don't find support to other studies that say that there is a more positive image of Mexico in those scripts. You will notice as well that we break the films in different groups, trying to break or analyze different periods from 2000 to 2004 and comparing that with 2005 to 2009. And you will notice as well that the sample is not similar in each period. That was because when we were noticing or reading the scripts, even if some of the films are located in Mexico or having Mexican characters, if you read the script, you don't have any kind of connotation about, or descriptor about this environment or these characters. So we erase that, or at least we put out of the sample those scripts, and we take others from these years just to have a more homogeneous sample. And the third research question, is having Mexico as the primary location for the contemporary Hollywood films a relevant factor for producing more positive representations of Mexico and Mexicans? The truth is that conducting an ANOVA, we notices that this statistical test does not suggest a significant difference. Having as a primary location Mexico, or one place in Mexico in the film, it is not a trait that could indicate a positive representation or a negative representation of the country. It's just one location more in the film. And the fourth research question that was related to the presence of Mexican characters in those scripts, we noticed that indeed, including more Latinx characters in the films has a positive influence on representations of Mexicans. But it's also interesting that when we are noticing that these characters are present in the film, there is also a prevalence to present Mexico in a negative way in certain ways. We are trying to infer that probably is because as there are Mexican characters present in the story and they are more relevant in the narrative, they are able to criticize a little bit more the country. And that's something that came out from this analysis. What is important is, or what are the points to discuss about this research? Well, that the stereotypes of Mexico are reinforced in the presence of negative depictions. Every time that we have a negative depiction in the film about Mexican or Mexicans, they are relying on stereotypes that are based on what Dr. Rendon was saying, stereotypes that were built during the previous era of Hollywood cinema, stereotypes that were probably related to what we know from the golden age of Mexican cinema are very similar. Those representations that Hollywood took from that moment and exploited in a certain way, very similar to what we are finding right now in those films. There is not an evolution to more positive Hollywood narratives about Mexican and Mexicans. We cannot notice that from the study. And also Hollywood films about Mexico and Mexicans did not regularly portray the US or whites as the saviors of the Latin American country. This is interesting because at least they are trying to equal the situation and the context of the characters that are presented in those stories, in the sense that they are not giving more weight to a white savior, at least in narratives where the prevalence of Mexican characters is relevant. Hollywood films produced in the years from 2000 to 2018 presented a series of inconsistencies in the sense that we cannot recognize a pattern. We jump from one field to another and we notice how each film is presenting in a different ways Mexico and Mexicans. There is not a tendency during these films to present or to represent the country and the people that inhabit this country or that country in a way that it's similar in each film. And the inclusion of Mexican or even Latinx characters as a protagonist in those stories serves as a point of reference to have a more positive vision of Mexicans and Latinx characters. And also, as I was telling you, there is a prevalence of certain critiques about Mexico or overall the context or the environment of the country. We can conclude that it will seem that Hollywood production is somewhere between cultural stereotypes of previous periods, but also more interesting representation of the country and its inhabitants. It's trying to integrate them, even if not in a very positive way. They are having a place in the narratives that Hollywood is developing right now. And the integration of characters whose origin is Mexican allows as well a development of stories that can provide a multicultural perspective in the sense that narratives could address issues or topics more relevant to Mexicans and Mexico, and trying to understand in a similar way how we compare those narratives with the context that is occurring in the US. And if we have these both worlds, those narratives that has Mexican characters are trying to deal with a sense that we are similar to the US people or the US population.
Thank you, Gabriel. We have a bunch of questions here. So Dixie is asking, thank you, Dixie Santana, who is joining us from the Universidad Panamericana in Guadalajara, Mexico. So what software did you use for the analysis? We used an online tool for textual analysis that is called Voyant, V-O-Y-A-N-T. And we use that to do the textual analysis. Then Curtis is asking if the categories that you showed, that Gabriel showed in the first slide of the results, are those categories related to the genre of the movies? We didn't find any connection to a specific genre. What we did find is that, for instance, movies that are violent, like for instance, Sicario, if you remember that film, they also have, even though it's a very violent topic, and of course the whole movie is about how dangerous some northern states in Mexico are, or some areas specifically, they also have some positive representations within those films. And I think this is a key finding for this study, because we didn't find a more positive evolution of the representations of Mexico and Mexicans in Hollywood films, but we did find that there is an ambivalent relationship with the country and Mexicans, right? So there is another question here from Paul. Does this stereotyping of in and out groups in Hollywood filming also occur in commonly viewed Mexican shows, such as evening soap operas? If so, is there overlap or differences between the in and out groups for Hollywood and Mexican film producers? So we didn't actually, we haven't looked at telenovelas or soap operas as they are called in English, but I think there is some of that stereotype in some cultural products also in Mexico, right? Remember that the Hollywood industry is so powerful all over the world that also in Mexico, it's the dominant film industry, right? So all of the films that are produced by Hollywood are showed in Mexico, and they are even presented at the same time or released at the same time as here in the US. And some of the Mexican productions, in some cases, I would say, I haven't conducted a formal study about this, but I would think that, or I think that I've seen some of the same stereotypes that we have seen in Hollywood films also in Mexican films. What do you think, Gabriel?
And also, I will add that probably not only on soap operas or Mexican television, if we look at Netflix and all the contents that are produced by digital platforms, probably we will find a more prevalent, at least a more prevalent presence of negative stereotypes. I'm guessing this, as Dr. Rendon was saying, we have not conducted a similar study in this field. But probably if we look at those products, we will find a prevalence of more negative images, even in productions that are created by a Mexican crew. Maybe I'm thinking about the original productions that Netflix has on Mexico that are also part of the platform, as Narcos Mexico, for example, or The House of Flowers, La Casa de las Flores, which I believe that probably are dealing with those stereotypes, are reinforcing certain negative images about the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I could jump in real quick.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I agree. And in fact, after finishing the last season of Ozark, I think last week, I texted Gabriel immediately and said, you really need to think about doing something on these series, because I don't know if any of you saw it, but it's brutal. It's a brutal treatment of Mexico, basically defined, by narcotraficantes. On the question that Paul raised. I would be a little bit careful about doing the cross-industry comparison between film and television. I totally agree with what Hector said about the influence of Hollywood, although actually Gabriel is going to be doing his dissertation on sort of a redefinition of Mexico on different terms, by these great filmmakers located in Mexico now. But actually, there's a counter argument that's been made that since the 1960s, basically the U.S. television space in Spanish has been dominated by Mexican interests, and Univision has been dominating primetime, and that's content, at least in primetime, that is almost exclusively produced in Mexico. And so it's hard to get sort of outside some of those tropes and characterizations that are pretty prevalent in sort of the telenovelas coming out of Mexico. There was a period where it got shaken up quite a bit in the 90s, and they were doing some racier stuff to compete with TV Globo and Venevisión and some other producers, the Colombians, but it seems like they've sort of retrenched back to the Cinderella stories, or the narco stories tend to dominate now, coming out of Mexico. But in that sense, I think with the narco genre, there is a sort of a correspondence because of the violence and that whole sort of very clear distinction between good and bad, and playing on that.
Absolutely. We have one more question from Nadia Flores. Can you please discuss a little bit the movie Roma and its big success in the context of your research study and findings? So you want to go ahead, Gabriel, or do you want me to address it?
If you want, I can say something about Roma. We did not take into consideration Roma, as Roma was presenting more like a Mexican film, not a co-production, I will say in that way, as it's part of Netflix and Mexico as well. And if we notice the companies that were behind the film is at least advertised as a Mexican one. So that was the reason which this film is not part of the study. But I have conducted other studies about the impact of Roma in Mexican and Mexican American students to see which are the traits that they identify as related to Mexican culture. And I can say that probably there is a prevalence as well of negative and positive traits there. They are, at least the results of that study showed that there is a prevalence of classicism as a negative trait, and the family as a nuclear structure that is the basis of the Mexican culture. So they are using those references to talk about Roma at least related to a Mexican culture, to the Mexican culture.
And I should say that the main issue in Roma, which is the treatment that the rich family gives to the person who works at their house, is something that has been in the newspaper headlines in Mexico for a long time, because they were trying to introduce legislation to protect the rights of these workers. And of course, Alfonso Cuarón, the director of Roma, he saw this opportunity, and he was very good at grabbing that opportunity, because it has been a common discussion in recent years in Mexico that is asking people, how are we treating people who have less privileges than other people, right? And especially because the people who work in these positions at home, at different homes for other people, they are normally people from indigenous communities in Mexico. So that extends to the question on how the Mexican society, in the same way that the Hollywood films are portraying Mexico and Mexicans in some cases with a negative light, then Mexico and the Mexican cultural products, they are portraying, of course, there are studies about this out there, they are portraying indigenous populations as inferiors, right? And they are Mexicans as well. So in the same way, some Mexicans can complain about the media representations of Hollywood films, I think indigenous populations within Mexico, they can do the same with the Mexican media. So unfortunately, we are running out of, well, we have run out of time. One last question from Edmund Cueva. Paranormal Activities, the film marked once seemed like a well-meaning attempt to reach out to the Latinx community, but it reverted to the traditional stereotypical Hollywood image of Mexican Americans on the West Coast as associated with or resorting to gang life. Have you seen the film? If so, any thoughts? I honestly have not seen it. Have you seen it, Gabriel?
Yes, I have seen it, and I will say that it's an interesting attempt. We don't take it that precise film in the study, as we have certain limitations. We couldn't find all the scripts online to analyze exactly how they're referring to Mexico or Mexicans. And the other limitation is sometimes even when those films are presenting Mexican characters, as we were analyzing the script, during the conversations, during the dialogue or the descriptions, they were not talking about Mexico or Mexicans. That's why probably some of these films are presenting Mexican or Latinx characters, but they are not related precisely with the context of Mexico or Mexicans living in Mexico.